Heidi here from Rain Country. God is good all the time. And I'm here today to talk about dehydrated meals, give you some ideas of the kinds that you can make and how you might want to use them or why you might want to put some of these things up. So the first thing I'm going to do is share with you some of the actual meals that I've experimented with in dehydrating and then rehydrating and consuming. The first one I ever did was my homemade chili and then what I call my Tar Heel beans. And that worked out so good. I already had all this stuff made up. I always make a big pot of either one of those. And I thought, instead of canning all the excess, I should go ahead and just try dehydrating it because it would take up less space. And I love it. It is now the only way I will put up the excess of that, because not only is it going to take up less space, well, I shouldn't say only way. I still will like to have a few jars of chili, something I like to keep in the vehicles in case you get stuck along the road, because you can just eat it right out of the jar. Well, you can do that with the dried stuff too. It's actually quite good, but you don't even have to worry about adding water to it in that case. But when it comes to storing it or taking camping, hiking and whatnot, then having it in a dried form is going to take up less space and be far lighter in weight. Now, one of the other things I did was homemade soup that I actually already had canned up, and I thought, well, let me go ahead and try dehydrating a jar, and I really liked it. It rehydrated super easy, even though it doesn't look very pretty all dehydrated up. Once it was rehydrated, you could see the bits of vegetables in there, the corn and the carrots and whatnot, and it tasted just as good as when I canned it. And then a couple other things I did were some pasta dishes, like I did some homemade lasagna. I did both the standard lasagna with the red sauce, and I did the creamy chicken lasagna. I did some homemade spaghetti, which I still have some here. And yes, in this case, I did go ahead and break up the rest of it into little pieces and put it in a small jar. And let's see what else. I did some fried rice and some stroganoff. And so all of them turned out really good. They rehydrated really easy. It's just a matter of adding the right amount of water, which can be tricky. And here's a tip some people gave is when you go to dehydrate it, you want to weigh it out before you put it on the dehydrator so that you know what it weighs. Then you can take that amount, that same amount, then you can get your scales out, put that amount in that you had dehydrated up beforehand. You'd have to write all this information down ahead of time, and then add enough water to that little pot that you're going to be cooking it in, heating it in, and then until it weighs what it weighed before you dehydrated it. That should get your water content pretty accurate. Now I'm not going to be good at remembering all that and writing all that kind of stuff down, especially if you're dehydrating a bunch at a time, but you're not going to be eating all that at once. Then you'd probably want to dehydrate it in serving size portions, which brings me to the idea on the spaghetti that after I dehydrated the spaghetti with the sauce on it, then I went to put it in the jar. I realized, oh, dang, I'm going to have to, if I want it to save space, I'll have to break the spaghetti up into teeny tiny pieces. And that was when I thought, oh, what I could do is make it like in little piles and dehydrate it like that so that it's about the size of the canning jar I want to store it in, if you're storing it in a canning jar. And then those should be pretty close to serving size amounts anyway. Dehydrate it like that, and then you could just layer it into your jar or even in your Mylar bags if you're doing that. I got to talk more about that though before you get all excited about Mylar bags. And then that way you could just pull out like a little cake of the spaghetti at a time, or two if you want. Now then Deb, who's one of my moderators on my channels, she suggested even using little soap molds like you would for making the round soaps, and that would keep it all contained in a nice circular fashion. That would actually be the perfect size for layering into your jars. And you could actually, speaking of the weighing and all that, you could do that same idea with any of the other items, be it the fried rice, the Alfredo, whatever it is that you're dehydrating up, lasagna and so on. And that will make it easy. Now with soup, I don't care because I just pour it in there and just keep adding water as needed. And do it that way. Now you can, some other ideas that aren't necessarily meals, but things you might want separate would be some of your sauces, like your barbecue sauce. Like Deb had mentioned, even using that as a seasoning, a dry seasoning after powdered up. I've dehydrated up some salsa, and I've dehydrated up spaghetti sauce by itself. And this image, this wasn't dehydrated spaghetti, this was spaghetti I'd cooked fresh, then took the sauce that I had dehydrated up, added water, rehydrated it, and then put it on top. And it was great. It turned out really great. So you may not necessarily want it as a whole meal. Like someone said, well, if your noodles are already dry, why not just dehydrate your sauce instead and have it separate? Now, I'm going to come back to that topic in a minute. I just wanted to bring that up for people who may prefer to keep those items separate. Now, a couple more things would be like your bone broth. I do like to dehydrate up a lot of my bone broth, and then I can use that to make a fresh soup. Maybe I don't want all of my soup to taste the same, but keeping the bone broth on hand that I've made from leftover bones from whatever, then I can use that in anything, and you can also use it in making gravies. And by the way, I have videos out on like how to dehydrate bone broth, or at least how I do it, and a few other things like that. And then I have a video on dehydrating meats, and right here is some dehydrated turkey from 2022. Now, while I'm on the meat topic, let me cover the ways of dehydrating. When it comes to dehydrating up meats of any kind, it doesn't matter what kind, other than ground meat. If you're, let's say you're baking up a chicken, you're baking up a turkey, you're baking up a beef roast or an elk roast or something, the best way to get it to turn out so that it will rehydrate easy, be nice and crispy, unless you're planning on powdering it anyway. If you're going to powder it, this doesn't matter. But if you would like to keep it in pieces and not have it be tough and chewy like a jerky, what I found out just basically by accident, by taking, after you've cooked the meat, it has to be pre-cooked. So let's say you can't just pull some raw meat out of the freezer and dehydrate it and expect it then to turn out crispy. You've got to cook it, then you freeze all that, whatever's left over of the meat, just like I've been doing with the turkey. You freeze it, then you take it out after it's been fully frozen, and I'd leave it in there for a couple of days at least. Then you take that meat and just thaw it enough that you can spread it out on your dehydrator sheets and then dehydrate it, and then it will turn out crispy and light. If you take that meat that's been cooked and don't freeze it first, it won't have that same texture. It will be hard and chewy and almost impossible to fully rehydrate. Then the only way to really use it in sauces and so on is to then powder it. So it's going to be a matter of choice. Now, when it comes to ground meat, that's not important. As long as you just cook it, you can dehydrate it as is, and it works out great. No issues there. Then the other thing that you can do is, let's say you have a bunch of meat that's canned up. So you've canned up some beef, you've canned up some salmon, you've canned up some turkey or chicken. Because those things were pressure canned, there's no need then, if you want to dehydrate them, for you to freeze them. They've already gone through a process that, just like the way the freezing breaks the meat down, so does the pressure canning. Then you can just put that, you just open up your jars, put it directly onto your sheets and dehydrate it up. And I've done both. I've done that with beef that I've canned. I've done that with fish that I've canned. And it turned out the same as the meats that I had cooked, frozen, and then dehydrated. And then, of course, the vacuum sealing into jars being important, especially when it comes to meat, especially if you're leaving any of the fat in, which you can do. You just got to make sure you vacuum seal it to prevent rancidity if it's going to be back there for a while. Now, let's come back to the why would you want to dehydrate pasta or beans. Like this right here is just plain, pretty much just plain pinto beans. Why would I do that when they're already in a dry state to begin with. Well, one thing with beans, dry beans, is they can get harder and harder and harder in storage if you're not working through them faster. But once you cook them and dehydrate them, they're going to keep that texture, which is very crispy and light. So here's the thing, is that consider how long it takes to cook pasta that's already in a dry form when you get it, but it's still raw. How long does it take to cook that? It's not super long, but it's still going to be much longer than rehydrating it, which all you need is some hot water and let it sit. I still will kind of cook it a little bit, but it cooks up much faster than cooking some raw dry pasta. And same thing with the beans, especially any kind of beans, because it only takes a few minutes at most to get them fully rehydrated. But when you're cooking the bean from a dry, raw state, it can take hours and hours, maybe even a couple of days, depending on how hard those beans are. So by dehydrating them like this, you've now made it so that they make a more instant meal. Now here's an example with the chili. When I went to rehydrate it, it was just about as quick adding that water, putting it on the stove, letting it get good and hot and rehydrated, as me taking a jar of chili that I pressure canned and putting it in a pan and just heating it through. It's pretty much the same. There's hardly any difference in time. If there is a difference, it's only going to be a minute or two. It's very quick. And so this is why I really like this. And then again, the same applies to your pasta dishes. Now, here's a fun little tip you might want to know, is that since I had a lot of these different things that I've been trying out in dehydrating and rehydrating, I still had some things like the spaghetti and the creamy chicken lasagna that I had not yet rehydrated and eaten. And I decided, you know what? I'm going to try these dry and see what I think. I love them. They're like a crispy, yummy snack. So you're getting that wonderful taste of that dinner, but more like a crispy snack. So same thing with the spaghetti. But anyway, that was really good. So even if you're in a situation where you've got these things dehydrated up, maybe you're on the road, maybe you're camping, maybe you're hiking or whatever, and you're hungry, you can just pull it out and eat it like that. You don't even have to rehydrate it. And the noodles, while they're still crunchy, they're not as hard and crunchy as they are when they're in their dry, raw state. So they just chew up a lot easier. And then the meat was crunchy and crispy, so tasty. So let me come back and talk a little bit again about storage. So with any of this stuff, if you're putting on your shelf, I highly recommend vacuum sealing it into jars, especially anything that's got meat or any kind of fatty type stuff in it, like the cheese. Vacuum sealing it's going to prevent rancidity in storage. That's really important when it comes to your meats, and especially anything that contains fat. Now, you can store in Mylar. I just highly suggest being careful, especially with something like spaghetti that can be very pokey. That what I recommend you do, and I haven't tried this yet, but I would recommend at least trying it first with a small amount. Put it inside a paper bag or something that's going to protect the Mylar from the inside. Then you have that in your Mylar bag. And then if you're gonna, usually with Mylar, it's easier to use oxygen absorbers, and people know I talk about these things all the time. Yes, I have some on hand because they came with some of the Mylar bags I bought, but I hate oxygen absorbers. However, when it comes to Mylar, if you actually have some that work, then you can just throw one of those into your Mylar bag, and that's gonna be great for tossing into your go bags that you keep in your rigs, or like I said, to take hiking, camping, and so on. Now, when it comes to the Mylar, I don't know what the weight of this is. I'm guessing it's not as heavy as the stuff I've been buying more recently. I've had these for a while, and I hardly ever use these. But I suggest, especially with your dried things like this that can be rough, especially like the spaghetti, and cause holes, go with a heavier weight, like at least a 5 mil, 7 mil Mylar. It's going to be more expensive, but you're going to be far less likely to get holes poked in it, especially if you can have some kind of barrier around it like the paper. I think that's a really good idea. But anyway, they do make them much smaller than this. I know I have some that are half this size. And that, to me, the ones that are half this size, so they look about more like that, will be a better size, maybe even smaller, for if you're wanting each one to be its own meal. And then you can also get, like this is going to be, that's also going to add to the cost, but it is nice to get the ones with the Ziploc, but you can still seal them. You can still heat seal them up here, and then they have the little notch where you can tear that off. So even though you might not be able to heat seal it again, you'll still have your Ziploc on there that you can just reseal it up if you need to, or recycle that bag and use it for something else, which again is where your heavier weight Mylar is going to be nice to have on hand, because it's going to be more apt to be able to be reused, where the thinner ones, where they're going to wear, they're going to get holes in them, they might not work so well for recycling. So when it comes to dehydrating meals, now keep in mind this is all about dehydrating, not freeze drying. This is for the sake of the people that don't have a freeze dryer, can't afford a freeze dryer, or like me, just flat out don't want one. There's a lot you can do dehydrating, but you're going to have to experiment and find out which things you prefer to have dehydrated, what works best for you for meals. And just like I suggested here, your beans, rice, and pasta dishes, especially something that's a one dish meal, those I so far have found all the ones I've done have turned out really good. And then just if you want to try something else, if you're already making that meal, then take just a little tiny bit of that while you're dehydrating other things already, so you're not wasting the energy, and then put that on your tray, just a small enough amount that you can try it. You can try it dry. You can also then rehydrate it and see how well that turns out. And this is how you're going to find out if that's even going to be something you will want to do before you fill up all your trays with something and find out you really hate it. And this is how I do everything now. I don't just assume that something's going to turn out really good. Like I did assume the yellow mustard I went to dehydrate was going to turn out really good, but I'm glad I still only did a little bit and followed my own advice on that, even though I was tempted to just fill up the whole dehydrator with it, because it ended up tasting terrible and I ended up having to throw it out. But even with that advice on the mustard, I would say still try a tiny bit and see if maybe you don't mind the flavor. Maybe you think it tastes good. I personally thought it tasted horrible, so I won't do it again. But just keep trying things. That's how you're going to learn. So, and I've done the same thing with avocado, fresh avocado. I took one little slice, cut that slice into little pieces, dehydrated it up. It dehydrated beautifully. It powdered up beautifully. It tasted terrible, even though the avocado it came from was an absolutely amazing tasting avocado. The dehydrating process just changed the flavor and made it gross. So I'm glad I only tried that with a tiny bit instead of assuming it was going to be really good. So always experiment first before you dedicate a whole bunch of your food to something you've never done before to find out you really hate it. And maybe somebody else loves it, but you find out you don't like it. That's why I always say try it no matter what anyone says about it. Try a little bit first, because it may not suit you, or it may. So anyway, any thoughts, ideas, your own experiments, please share them in comments down below. And don't forget to check out the video links I'll also be putting in the description box by clicking on more or show more somewhere down here below the video screen. And thanks for watching. Take care and God bless.